Alright, the intention of this video is to show you how to do points, how to bring in points and how to manipulate them in the drawing. So I'm starting with a blank drawing here, and I'm going to go ahead and import a point file, and we're going to look at some of the different things that you can do with that point file. So the first thing first is you want to import your points. So we're going to go up to the points drop down menu. We're going to go down to import and export points, and we're going to import points. Alright, so now I'm going to navigate and find my file. The typical file for most surveying and engineering, we use point number, northing, easting, elevation, and description. And comma delimited is very common. Comma delimited usually has less problems, so I recommend use comma delimited. So you can see here the format is P for point, N for northing, E for easting, Z for the elevation or the Z value, and D for description. So that's the type, the file type. That's the 99% of the stuff I do is in this format. So then I need to go and find the source file. I'm going to click on the little folder on the right, and I'm going to go to it's in my documents. So I'm going to bring in GME66 topo points. These are all the same points that you'll be using for your final project. So I'm going to click OK, and then I'm going to click OK. Now this Kogo database import options, it's just asking you what you want to do. What do you do if the point numbers are supplied by the source? I typically use them. I don't typically add an offset unless I know that I have duplicate point numbers. I try to stay away from duplicate point numbers, but that happens sometimes. What to do when point numbers need to be assigned to the points? In other words, what if you have two different points? You have an existing point 2 and you're bringing in a new point 2. What do you do with it? You can use the next point number in the series, or you can that's available, or you can sequence from a very specific point. I usually sequence, so I have them up at 21,000. So that way I know anything I brought in that's up in the 21,000 range means that that's stuff that was duplicate from something else. What do you do when the point number already exists in the point base? And this is where this 21,000 would come in. I'm going to renumber it and put it up there. A lot of times you want to overwrite stuff. If you're responsible about your point files, that is, if you save all the different point files, give them good clean names so you know what they are. In other words, if you have topo data that you bring in, let's say you went to you're a surveyor and you went to the field, you bring in a bunch of points, you download that point file and you say topo data, and put the date to it. So whatever that date happens to be, 4/15, 2013, whatever it is. If you save that file, and then let's say you adjust those points, and then that you export a new point file that's called, topo data for 1513 adjusted, on such and such date or whatever. You need to have very clean point files. That way, if you ever overwrite points in your drawing, if you ever overwrite the points in your drawing, you can always go back to a previous point file and get that data back. Point files are very, very important. You want to keep those as long as you can. And a lot of people have been, I was told early on that you should export your point files every day. So once you're done doing a bunch of work, once you're done calculating a bunch of points, you need to export those right away and keep them. Because if AutoCAD crashes, which we all know it does on too frequent an occasion, if it crashes, a lot of times your point files will be the first thing that go. The points that are in your project they'll get messed up somehow. So I'm going to click OK. It's importing these points. There's quite a few points in here. There's something like 1,600 points. So it's going to insert those into the drawing for me. Okay, so it's inserted them into the drawing, so now they're not visible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ZE for zoom extents, and then I'm going to get all these points. Okay, so I made an error. I actually selected a point file that was space delimited and not comma delimited. So I'm going to go ahead and delete all these markers in there. I'm going to go into points, list points. We're just going to do this right over again. Just give me a minute to clear all these out. We're going to do that whole process again. So points, import points. I apologize. We're going to actually select, this time we're going to select a CSV. That CSV stands for comma separated values. That's another form. You can have a text file that is CSV. but a CSV file is always going to be CSV. Text file may be either or, and that's what happened in my particular case, was that I had a file that was a text file, but it wasn't a CSV on the inside. So we're going to try this again. Click OK. Now I'm going to do zoom extents. There we go. That's what I wanted to see. Okay, so I have a whole series of points here, and they're inserted into the drawing. So I can do quite a few things to these points. The first is that every point has a different description. In this particular case, the descriptions are based on a company file that we use. As an example, a 6 is a toe of a slope, a 7 is a top of a slope, a 1 is what we call a natural ground, or in other words, just a ground shot. It's just a shot to show elevation, basically, at that location. And then the rest of these are what we call BRE, stands for our company, that's Bedrock Engineering, and N and T stands for nail and tin. So these are our control points that we had for the survey work that we did. So you guys use those to determine bearings and distances between them, so you can show that information for your final project. In this particular case, though, I'm going to show you a little bit about how to view the point data and also about how to manipulate it. If you want to list points, you can go to points, list them, and let's just start by listing all points. You can take a look at all their different coordinates and elevations in this particular case. The other thing you can do is you can do a filtering. So in other words, you can include all the points that match a specific number. So let's say 1 through 200. And I'm going to go build list, and then I'm going to go over to list, and there's something like 18 points in there or something like that. Okay, so that's a way to filter it. You can also say include numbers. You can do it by the description. So let's include all the points that have a raw description of 6. I'm going to build list, and I can take a look at it. And so these are all the points that have a 6 elevation to them, or a 6 code to them. Let's pretend I want to see everything, but I don't want to see anything that's within this 2 through 17 range. I can also exclude points. So I can say exclude points with numbers matching, let's say 1-100. And I'm going to say build list. And then when I go back to the list, all those points that were below, that were through 2 through 17, are gone. So there's lots of different options here to include and exclude points. You can also create a group out of them. So if you create a group from that, you can have the same idea. So that way you can quickly look at point group information. You can import and export those by a group, and you can also include a group within your surfaces, which we'll do in a different video. All right, so the other thing that we can take a look at is we can also edit our points, and there's a couple different options here. Display properties changes the way the points look on the screen. So I'm going to click on that for a moment. And what it's asking me, which points do you want to modify? Do you want to modify all of them, a certain point range or numbers? Do you want to do a group or a selection or the dialog? And I'm just going to go, and dialog will look very similar to that list points thing. You can change specific ones. For right now, I'm going to open that command again, and I'm going to say all of them. I want to change all of them. Right now, my units are too large, so I'm going to go with a 1. And then I'm going to go with a marker of 0.5. That's pretty typical for me. I usually set the marker to something like a half the size of the text. So I'm going to click OK. And you can see now I can see in between the points a little bit better. There are some areas that are still going to be really dense just because of the way they were observed. But you can see a little bit better between these different points. So that's the display properties. Now, the other thing that I can do is I can go to points. I can say edit points. I can also change their coordinates. So I go to edit points, and this brings up the same screen, except now I can actually click on them and change their coordinates. Be very careful here, because if you change these points, you lost that point in the database. This shouldn't be a big deal to you, though, because you're keeping good point files. So you have these point files backed up somewhere. You could always bring them back. But just be very, very careful. If you change the easting or northing on a point, it changes it in your database forever. The only way you can get it back is if you re-import the point file. So a lot of times what I'll use this screen for is to edit descriptions. A lot of times I'll have descriptions that I didn't particularly, I either described it as the wrong thing or whatever it happens to be, and so I'll have to come in here and change those. So that's the edit points. The other thing we can do under edit points is we can do the datum. A datum shift is if you want to shift all the points up or down in their elevation. In other words, if you did an assumed coordinate system, a lot of times this happens in the survey world, you'll assume a coordinate system of 100 and then you'll need to shift it up to a benchmark that you found. That's how you would do it with datum. You can renumber, move, rotate, copy, erase, unerase. All these are pretty self-explanatory. Stay away from the translate and rotate points. They just have other connotations to them. If you need to translate or rotate, you really should use the move or rotate command. So that's editing. Checking points. What checking points allows you to do is allows you to see if there are points in your drawing that aren't in your database. This happens occasionally. If you get another drawing from another person and they don't send you the entire project file, you'll have to just suck these points out of the drawing and put them in your project file. It doesn't happen a lot, but sometimes you need to do that. Insert points in a drawing, remove points from drawing. It's pretty self-explanatory. It just pulls them out of the drawing. It doesn't delete them from your database. It just removes them from the drawing so you can't see them anymore. So that's pretty much, these are all these different points, create points up here, are different point commands to create different things. You need to play around with these. A lot of these are for very specific functions or routines. And then point management up here, point group manager allows you to look at the different groups that you've created. So I'm going to create a group right now with all points. I'm going to apply it. I'm going to call all points. And so this is a group that I can include all my points with. It shows me the point numbers over there, and then it also shows me the individual point numbers and their coordinates over here. So that's, for right now, that's pretty much what we need to do. Oh, point settings, if we go point settings, one of the things that I showed you guys in class that I want to go over again is when you insert a point, if you're going to insert points that you want to create break lines with, which we will be doing with surfaces here in a minute in a different video. If you need to do that, what I do is I insert them at actual elevations. So when I create my break lines, those elevations that are associated with the points, the break line snaps directly to that elevation. If you insert at a fixed elevation, which is what most people do, it puts all the points in the drawing, it puts the marker where that point exists, it puts it at an elevation of 0, even though that point has an elevation associated with it. If we stick them in at actual elevation, then the marker ends up at the elevation of that point. It's hard to visualize right now. Let's take a look at this real quick. If I go to View and I go to Orbit and I do Free Orbit, if you take a look at this, all these points are on a flat plane. See that? They have elevations. It put the marker that shows the point. It put them all at the same elevation, an elevation of 0. Okay, so I'm going to go. I'm going to go back to the top for a minute. Okay, so all those points are inserted at an elevation of 0. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to point settings. I'm going to insert these points at an actual elevation. Okay, I'm going to go back to points, insert points into the drawing. It's asking me what points. I'm going to go all. It's going to say, do you want to replace them all? I'm going to say yes, replace all of them, please. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into our view. I'm going to go orbit. You know what? Real quick, I'm going to change the edit points. I'm going to do their display properties. All. I'm going to just change that back to 1 and the marker at 0.5. Click OK. Just so it's a little bit easier to see. Now I'm going to go to view. I'm going to go to orbit, free orbit. Now you'll see when I rotate around, these points are actually set at the elevation that they were observed. You notice how you can see it in 3 dimensions now. They're not all on the same flat plane. So that's important. If you're doing 3D break lines, this can be really, really important. But just remember that when you snap 3D blinds or any lines between 2 points now, it's doing it 3-dimensionally. So that's great for break lines because that's really what we want in a break line. That's not so good for what we want to do in just general drafting. If we just want to show a line between 2 points, let's say 2 found monuments or something like that, we don't necessarily want it to be in 3 dimensions. The other reason that messes this up is that our line types, if we have dashed lines or lines with breaks in them and things like that, it can really mess up the spacing if they're in 3 dimensions. So that is, oops, that is the wrong view. Let me go back to, That's the bottom. We're going to go view, 3D views, top. Okay, so now we're back to where we were. So if you ever need to reinsert your points back at 0, it's pretty simple. You just go back to point settings, you do insert, and you do it at fixed elevation of 0, click OK, because eventually that's where you're probably going to want most of your drafting done. You say points, insert points in a drawing, all, and I'm going to replace all. Or if you only put a few on there, you only select that group or those numbers or whatever you need to do. Okay? So that brings us to points. If you need to export these points, let's say you calc a bunch of different points. You go to points, calculate points, manual as an example, and you just click one here and you give it a description of calced point and an elevation of 100 because you're calculating a point there, and then you click over here and do the same, and you click over here and do the same. Okay, that's fine. If you need to export these points, you need to put them in a group first. So I'm gonna, the first thing I'm gonna do is put those in a group. Okay, so I'm gonna select those and I'm gonna right click and go list points. That's the quick way of doing this. I'm gonna say create group. I'm gonna call this group calced points. Click OK, click OK. Okay, so now these points are in a point group. I'm gonna go to points, import export points. I'm going to go to export points, and I'm going to limit my points to a group called calc points because those are the only ones I want to export at this point. I could export all the points later, whatever you happen to need to do. Then I'm going to select a place to put them, call them calced points. I'm going to save it, and I'm going to click OK. So now I just exported a point file that is a CSV, comma separated values, out to an exported thing. Now, don't just call them calc points. Give them something that's important. I'm just doing this as an example. If you calced a bunch of sewer points, export those as sewer points. If you calced a bunch of top of curve points, export those as top of curve points. Just give it a point name that makes sense to you and that you can follow later. I like to put a date on the file as well. It just helps me quickly look and see when I did it. All right, so this concludes our video on points.